My name is Emma, and I want to tell you about how I destroyed the most popular girl in school after she tried to destroy me first. This is a story about teenage cruelty, social media warfare, and the kind of revenge that changes everything forever. 2 years ago, I was 17 years old and completely invisible at Westfield High School. I was not unpopular exactly. I was just nobody special. I got decent grades, had a small group of friends, and spent most of my time reading, studying, or working part-time at the local bookstore to help my single mom with expenses. I kept my head down, minded my own business, and tried to get through high school without drawing attention to myself. That strategy worked perfectly until the day I accidentally caught the attention of Madison Pierce, and my entire world fell apart. Madison was everything I was not. Stunningly beautiful, incredibly wealthy, socially powerful, and absolutely ruthless. She was the kind of girl who ruled high school like her personal kingdom, with a court of loyal followers who would do anything to stay in her good graces. Her father was a prominent businessman, her mother was on every charity board in town, and Madison herself was student body president, head cheerleader, and dating the captain of the football team. She was untouchable, and she knew it. The incident that started everything happened on a Tuesday morning in advanced placement literature class. Our teacher, Mrs. Davidson, had assigned us to analyze a poem about social justice and inequality, and when she called for volunteers to share their interpretations, the usual silence followed. Madison and her friends never volunteered in academic discussions. They saved their energy for more important things like planning parties and discussing their weekend shopping trips. But I had actually done the reading, understood the assignment, and had some thoughts I wanted to share. So when Mrs. Davidson looked around the room with growing frustration, I raised my hand and offered my analysis of how the poem reflected modern social hierarchies and the way power structures marginalize those without influence. It was a good analysis, thoughtful, well-reasoned, and clearly articulated. Mrs. Davidson was impressed and praised my insight, using my interpretation as a launching point for the rest of the class discussion. Several other students nodded along with my points, and for once, I felt confident and valued in an academic setting. I did not notice Madison's reaction at the time, but her friends later told me that she had been furious. Apparently, she hated being overshadowed in any context, even academic ones she usually ignored. More specifically, she was angry that a nobody like me had demonstrated intelligence and articulation that made her look shallow and unprepared by comparison. Madison's response was swift and devastating. It started small, whispered comments when I walked by, meaningful looks exchanged between her and her followers, subtle exclusions from conversations that stopped when I approached. But Madison was far too sophisticated in her cruelty to stick with amateur hour tactics. Her first major attack came through social media. Madison had over 3,000 followers on Instagram, and she used that platform like a weapon. She began posting subtle but pointed content that anyone who knew me would recognize as targeted harassment. She would post photos of herself looking perfect with captions about how some people try too hard to get attention by acting smart, but intelligence cannot fix ugly. She shared quotes about how authentic people do not need to show off with big words, clearly referencing my classroom participation. Most insidiously, she started a trend among her followers of using the hashtag #TryHardTuesday whenever someone was perceived as being too eager or attention-seeking. The hashtag caught on not just with Madison's immediate circle, but throughout the school. Students began using hashtag #TryHardTuesday to mock anyone who participated actively in class, answered questions enthusiastically, or demonstrated academic engagement. What had once been normal student behavior became socially unacceptable, and I was identified as the primary example of try-hard behavior to be avoided. The psychological impact was immediate and brutal. I stopped raising my hand in class, stopped participating in discussions, and began second-guessing every word I spoke in public. The confidence I had felt in academic settings evaporated, replaced by constant anxiety about whether anything I said would be seen as showing off or trying too hard. But Madison was just getting started. Her next attack was more personal and infinitely more cruel. She discovered that I worked at the bookstore after school and began showing up there with her friends, not to shop, but to create scenes that would embarrass me in front of customers and my employer. They would come in acting like they were browsing, then stage loud conversations about how pathetic it was that some people had to work retail jobs while others got to enjoy their teenage years. They would ask me loudly for help finding books about social skills or fashion advice, clearly implying that I needed both. Most humiliatingly, they would take photos and videos of me working, then post them on social media with captions about how sad it was when people had to work instead of having real social lives. My manager eventually had to ask Madison's group to leave because they were disrupting other customers, but not before they had accomplished their goal of making my workplace feel unsafe and humiliating. The campaign escalated when Madison discovered something about my personal life that she could weaponize: my mom's struggles with depression following my father's death 3 years earlier. I had never talked about my home situation at school because it was private and painful. My mom had been devastated by losing my dad in a car accident, and she had struggled with severe depression that made working difficult and left me handling most household responsibilities. We were barely getting by financially, which was why I worked at the bookstore and why I could not afford the same clothes, activities, and lifestyle as my wealthier classmates. Somehow, Madison found out about my family's situation, probably through her mother's connections in our small town, and she decided to use my personal tragedy as ammunition for her psychological warfare. She began making pointed comments about how some people use family problems as excuses for being antisocial and weird. She would stage conversations within my hearing about how depression was just an excuse for lazy people who did not want to take responsibility for their lives. Most cruelly, she began referring to me as Orphan Annie and encouraging others to use the nickname. The Orphan Annie name stuck, and soon students throughout the school were using it to refer to me. What had started as Madison's private cruelty became a school-wide joke at my expense, and I found myself identified primarily by my family tragedy, rather than anything positive about myself. But Madison's masterpiece of psychological torture was yet to come. She discovered that I had a crush on a boy named Tyler, who was in our math class. Tyler was sweet, funny, and kind, not part of Madison's social circle, but not a complete outsider either. I had never spoken to Tyler about my feelings, but I had confided in one of my friends that I thought he was cute and interesting. Madison somehow learned about my crush, probably through the social surveillance network that popular girls maintain, and she decided to use it to humiliate me in the most public and devastating way possible. She orchestrated an elaborate scheme where she convinced Tyler that I had been spreading rumors about him, then arranged for him to confront me publicly during lunch in front of the entire cafeteria. Tyler approached my table looking angry and confused, and when I looked up in surprise, he launched into a speech about how he had heard I was telling people we were dating, and that he needed to set the record straight that he would never be interested in someone like me. The entire cafeteria went silent as Tyler loudly announced that I was delusional if I thought he would ever want to date me, that I should stop embarrassing myself by having unrealistic fantasies, and that I needed to leave him alone because my attention was making him uncomfortable. I sat there in complete shock and humiliation as 300 students watched Tyler publicly reject me for a relationship I had never claimed we had. The laughter and whispered comments that followed were deafening, and I spent the rest of lunch hiding in the bathroom crying while students lined up outside to take photos and videos of my breakdown. The video of Tyler's rejection and my subsequent emotional collapse went viral on social media that same day. Madison had made sure multiple people recorded the incident from different angles, and she coordinated the posting across various platforms to maximize the humiliation and ensure the video reached as many people as possible. Within hours, #OrphanAnnieReject was trending locally, and I became a laughingstock not just at school, but throughout our entire town. The video was shared, commented on, and mocked by hundreds of people, many of whom did not even know me personally, but felt entitled to participate in my public humiliation. That night, I lay in bed listening to my phone buzz constantly with notifications, friend requests from strangers who wanted to follow the drama, comments on the viral video, and tagged posts making fun of my situation. I felt like my entire life had been destroyed by one coordinated attack, and I could not see any way to recover from the social devastation Madison had orchestrated. But something happened that night that changed everything. While I was scrolling through the endless stream of cruel comments and mockery, I noticed something interesting. Tyler himself had not posted anything about the incident. In fact, When I looked at his social media profiles, he seemed genuinely confused about why the incident had blown up so dramatically. More intriguingly, several people who had witnessed the cafeteria incident were posting their own videos and comments, and some of them were questioning the narrative. A few students mentioned that they had seen Madison talking to Tyler right before he approached my table, and that his behavior had seemed out of character for someone usually so kind and laid back. I realized that Madison's scheme might not have been as perfectly executed as she had intended, and that there might be evidence of her manipulation if I looked carefully enough. So I began investigating. I started by reaching out to Tyler directly through a private message, apologizing for any misunderstanding, and asking what exactly he had heard about me that made him so angry. His response was revealing. He said that Madison had told him I was bragging to people that we were secretly dating, and that I was planning to ask him to prom in a very public way that would embarrass him if he had to reject me. None of that was true, of course, but it explained why Tyler had felt the need to preemptively and publicly shut down a relationship that existed only in Madison's manipulative narrative. When I explained to Tyler that I had never claimed we were dating, and had never planned any public romantic gestures, he began to realize that he had been manipulated into attacking me for something I had never done. But Tyler's growing awareness was just the beginning of what I discovered. I began systematically documenting Madison's campaign against me, taking screenshots of every social media post, saving every video, and creating a timeline of her escalating harassment. What I found was a clear pattern of coordinated psychological warfare that had been building for months. More importantly, I discovered that Madison had made some crucial mistakes in her overconfidence. She had used her real social media accounts to coordinate attacks against me, leaving a digital trail of her harassment. She had involved so many people in her schemes that several of them had documented their participation, creating evidence of conspiracy and coordination. Most damaging of all, she had bragged about her success in destroying me to some of her followers, not realizing that some of those conversations had been screenshotted and saved. I also learned that I was not Madison's first victim. Through careful social media archaeology and conversations with other students, I discovered that Madison had systematically targeted and destroyed several other students over the years using similar tactics. There was Jennifer, a girl who had briefly challenged Madison for student government president, and had been subjected to a rumor campaign about stealing money from fundraisers. There was Alex, a boy who had been more popular than Madison's boyfriend, and had found himself the target of coordinated harassment until his family moved him to another school. There was Sarah, a girl who had been Madison's best friend until they had a falling out, after which Madison had spread intimate secrets that destroyed Sarah's reputation and social relationships. Madison was not just a typical mean girl. She was a serial psychological abuser who had perfected a system of social destruction that she used against anyone who threatened her dominance or simply annoyed her. But here is where the story takes a turn that Madison never saw coming. You see, while Madison was a master of social manipulation and psychological warfare, she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated her victim. I might have been quiet and socially awkward, but I was also intelligent, methodical, and highly motivated. And once I realized the full scope of Madison's cruelty and the pattern of victims she had left in her wake, I decided that someone needed to stop her before she destroyed anyone else. My revenge was not impulsive or emotional. It was calculated, comprehensive, and designed to hit Madison where it would hurt most: her reputation, her future prospects, and her sense of invulnerability. First, I gathered evidence. I compiled every piece of documentation I could find of Madison's harassment campaigns, not just against me, but against her previous victims. I reached out to Jennifer, Alex, Sarah, and others, and discovered that they all had similar stories of systematic psychological abuse orchestrated by Madison. Together, we created a comprehensive dossier documenting Madison's pattern of harassment, bullying, and social destruction. We had screenshots, videos, recorded conversations, and testimony from multiple victims spanning several years. Then I began my counterattack. I started by exposing Madison's manipulation of Tyler and the orchestrated nature of my public humiliation. I shared the evidence of how Madison had lied to Tyler to provoke his attack on me, how she had coordinated the recording and distribution of the incident, and how she had created the viral hashtag campaign that followed. The revelation that Tyler had been manipulated into attacking me based on lies created immediate sympathy for me and anger toward Madison. Students who had participated in mocking me began to realize they had been unwitting participants in a coordinated harassment campaign, and many of them felt guilty and angry about being used. But that was just the opening move. Next, I released the full documentation of Madison's history of psychological abuse. I created a detailed timeline showing how she had systematically targeted and destroyed multiple students over several years, using the same tactics of rumor spreading, social media harassment, and public humiliation that she had used against me. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Madison could not claim that her treatment of me was an isolated incident or a misunderstanding when I could prove that she had done the same thing to multiple other students using identical methods. The response was immediate and devastating for Madison. Students who had witnessed her previous campaigns began coming forward with their own observations and evidence. Teachers and administrators who had suspected something was wrong, but could never prove coordinated harassment suddenly had the documentation they needed to take action. Most damaging of all, Madison's own followers began to turn against her. Many of them had participated in her campaigns without fully understanding the scope and cruelty of what they were doing. And when faced with evidence of the systematic psychological abuse they had enabled, they felt guilty and angry. Some of Madison's closest friends revealed that they had always been somewhat afraid of her, worried that they could become her next target if they ever fell out of favor. The loyalty she had commanded was based on fear rather than genuine friendship. And once her victims began speaking out, her followers no longer felt obligated to protect her. But my revenge was far from complete. I made sure that Madison's behavior was reported to school administrators with full documentation and victim testimony. The evidence of systematic harassment, cyberbullying, and psychological abuse was so comprehensive that the school had no choice but to take serious disciplinary action. Madison was suspended from school, removed from her position as student body president, and kicked off the cheerleading team. More importantly, the incident became part of her permanent academic record, which would affect her college applications and future opportunities. I also ensured that Madison's parents and the wider community learned about her behavior. I shared the documentation with local news outlets, community organizations, and social media groups where Madison's family was active. The story of systematic bullying and psychological abuse at our high school became a local scandal, and Madison's family faced social consequences for their daughter's actions. Most satisfying of all, I made sure that Madison's future victims would be protected. I worked with school administrators to implement new policies about bullying and harassment, created support systems for students who were being targeted, and established protocols for documenting and reporting coordinated harassment campaigns. The impact on Madison was swift and total. She went from being the most popular and powerful student at school to being a social pariah overnight. Students who had once competed for her attention now avoided her. Teachers watched her suspiciously, and administrators monitored her behavior constantly. Her college prospects were severely damaged by the disciplinary action and negative recommendations from school officials. Her social media following evaporated as people distanced themselves from her toxic behavior. Her relationship with her boyfriend ended when he realized how cruel and manipulative she really was. Most importantly, her power to hurt other students was completely destroyed. No one trusted her anymore, no one wanted to be associated with her. And everyone knew that her victims now had support systems and documentation protocols that would protect them from her psychological warfare. But the sweetest part of my revenge was not Madison's destruction. It was my own transformation and the liberation of her other victims. Once Madison's reign of terror ended, I was able to rebuild my social life and academic confidence. Students who had avoided me out of fear of Madison's retaliation began approaching me with apologies and friendship. Teachers who had witnessed my decline and recovery praised my strength and intelligence. My work at the bookstore became a source of pride rather than shame as customers learned about my resilience and determination. More importantly, Madison's other victims were finally able to heal and move forward. Jennifer was able to run for student government again without fear of harassment. Alex, who had moved schools, was able to return and finish his senior year with his original friends. Sarah was able to rebuild her reputation and social relationships without Madison's interference. The culture of fear and intimidation that Madison had created was replaced by a culture of support and accountability. Students looked out for each other, reported harassment when they saw it, and refused to participate in coordinated attacks against their classmates. Madison tried several times to rebuild her reputation and social standing, but the evidence of her systematic cruelty was too comprehensive and well documented for anyone to forget or forgive. She finished high school as an isolated, powerless figure who served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of psychological abuse. Today, 3 years later, I am thriving in college, studying psychology with a focus on adolescent social dynamics and bullying prevention. Madison, I heard, struggled to get into any of her preferred colleges and ended up at a community college where no one knew about her past. The experience taught me that bullies derive their power from their victims' silence and isolation. Once I broke that silence and connected with other victims, Madison's carefully constructed system of psychological warfare collapsed completely. Sometimes the best revenge is not destroying your enemies, but exposing them for what they truly are and protecting others from suffering the same fate. Madison lost everything she valued: her popularity, her power, her reputation, and her future prospects. Not because I was cruel to her, but because I simply told the truth about her cruelty to others. That is the price of being a psychological predator. That is the cost of systematically destroying other people for your own entertainment. And that is why you should never underestimate the quiet kids. We might not fight back immediately, but when we do, we fight to win.